While the rallying cry of the first wave feminism belonged to the demand for voting rights, that of the second wave feminism was a direct attack against patriarchy and patriarchal narratives of systematic structures. Today, in this video, we are going to look at a dozen second wave feminists and understand their thoughts and their philosophy. In 2010, the New York Times wrote, "The second sex was an act of Promethean audacity, a theft of Olympic fire from which there is no turning back. For many, there was one world before the 38-year-old Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex or La Deuxième Sexe in 1949, and an entirely different one after." Beauvoir had set out to write a confessional essay as she'd become a newly established public writer. As she began to consider herself, she began to consider what it was to be a woman. After hours of reading feminine mythology, she wrote, "It was a revelation. This world was a masculine world. My childhood was nourished by myths concocted by men. The result was the second sex." This book has three main ideas: that men are everything, as she writes, he is the subject, he is the absolute, and she is the other. The second being that women's ultimate quest is not happiness but freedom, and most famously, that women are not born but made. Beauvoir is considered a pioneer in making a distinction between sex and gender, whereby sex is rooted in biology and gender is a historical, social, and political construct. For many in the 1940s, Beauvoir's feminism, in part, inspired by the existentialism of her lifelong partner Jean-Paul Sartre, was deeply shocking. The Vatican had the book put on the index of prohibited books, and she was accused of ridiculing France. In the 1970s, Beauvoir became involved with the women's liberation movement. She spent time with the likes of Betty Friedan and Kate Millett, and in 1971, she wrote and signed the Manifesto of 343, in which women confessed to having illegal abortions. Unfortunately, The Second Sex was originally translated into English by an American zoologist who accused Beauvoir of having verbal diarrhea. The translation was grossly inaccurate and savagely cut. It wasn't until 2009 that an accurately translated edition was published. This itself proved Beauvoir's theory that the other woman was voiceless in a man's world. The Second Sex completely questioned the structural nature of power, and in turn, a woman's role in the world and her capabilities. Not only did Beauvoir articulate an inherent oppression, she recognized how this causes an identity crisis for women in a man's world. It was truly radical. Louise Irigare was a multidisciplined intellectual who challenged the male perspective and dominance in the Western canon of philosophy and psychoanalytic thinking. It's not easy or perhaps particularly appropriate to relay Irigare's biography, as she believed the male-dominated academic establishment used personal information to undermine the work of challenging women. But it is important to note that she moved to Paris to study psychology in the 1960s and started attending lectures of Jacques Lacan. In 1974, she published Speculum of the Other Woman. The book had an explosive reaction that saw Irigare lose her university teaching position at the request of Lacan himself. Irigare had criticized not only Lacan, but Freud, Plato, Descartes, and Hegel. She claimed that in all their philosophy and theory, what constitutes the ego, that is the experience of being, is always seen through a male perspective. She also crucially criticized the fact that their ideas of self-made male identity ignored the fact that the male self had a nurturing, influential, and essential mother. Irigare called this cultural matricide, and in 1981 she wrote, all Western culture rests on the murder of the mother. A very radical thing to say. Feminist Jane Clare Jones wrote in the New Statesman, her writing made me aware of the gaping absence in our culture of representations of female sexuality not shaped by the needs and desires and gaze of men. In 1977, Irigare published This Sex Which Is Not One, which expanded on these themes as well as applying Marxist ideas of capital, commodity and transaction to a woman's place in society. Irigare was also known for her theory of sexual difference, which has been criticized for essentialist notions of gender. She has been ridiculed by male thinkers such as Richard Dawkins for her gendering of philosophy, science and law. Yet Irigare's contribution to feminist theory is important. She took the very foundations of philosophical thinking. And even in today's light, her work forces us to continue to reconsider how we see ourselves in the world through our own filters and those of others. Now we come to Ellen Sikhsu, the creator of a feminist language. Ellen Sikhsu is known as the mother of post-structuralist feminist theory. She was a fierce and intellectual prolific writer, including poetry, plays, literary criticism, and philosophy. She is deemed one of the heavyweights of both French intellectualism and feminism. In 1974, she founded the first Center of Feminist Studies in Europe at the University of Paris, and in 1975, she published Le Rire de Medusa, which translates itself as The Laugh of Medusa, which became a key text in feminist scholarship and introduced a radical new understanding of the relationship between language and sexuality. It was here that Sikhsu created écriture féminine, a writing style that infused and inscribed the experience of the feminine body into language. It was, for Sikhsu, a rejection of the binary domination of patriarchy, which left woman as the other. Instead, Sikhsu argued for a new language for women to express themselves in, free from the oppressive restraints of patriarchal dominance echoed in the structure of existing language. Sikhsu's écriture féminine was a mixture of creative with the academic, including both dense theory and colloquialisms. It was made up of fragmented syntax and flowing, open, endless verse. It resisted the order, linear form, and authority of the male-created language, which she believes does not allow women to truly write and speak their experience. Sikhsu famously wrote in The Laugh of the Medusa, "Women must write herself, must write about women and bring women to writing from which they have been driven away as from their bodies, for the same reason, by the same laws, with the same fatal goal." Now, I will say certain things about Monique Wittig, who was an avant-garde novelist. Monique Wittig was a pioneering radical lesbian feminist who expressed her feminism through experimental, often utopian novels, often devoid of men and made up of a completely avant-garde style of language. Her first novel, L'Opoponax, published in 1964, told the story of a rebellious young girl in a convent and won the Prix Medici Literary Award. The novel, in which the schoolgirls refer to themselves in the third person, was received by critics as a radical take on child consciousness. Her next novel, Les Guerrières, was described by Sally Beeman in the Times Book Review as perhaps the first epic celebration of women ever written. Here too, the language was, at times, completely deconstructed, with a giant O appearing on pages. Margaret Reynolds of The Guardian wrote that every page is a call to arms, the women affirming triumph that all action is overthrow. This was followed by Le Corps Lesbien in 1973 and Virgile Non in 1983, both similarly experimental and promoting a radical notion of womanhood. Wittig rejected the larger structures too. She had a distaste for identity politics, something very much at odds with her contemporaries. She even famously said, Lesbians aren't women because they do not exist under the patriarchal rule of a sexist society. She rejected the notion of women's literature too, even though she helped to create a women's studies department at the University of Arizona, where she taught in later life. Wittig was praised by the elder French feminist community, including Beauvoir and Marguerite Duras, and was recognized by many as one of the leading lights of the second wave feminist movement. She became a founding member of the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes and helped organize a separate group called the Féministes Révolutionnaires. Her writing was unapologetically daring, women-focused, and original. She imagined a lesbian paradise for women that helped shape a new narrative and mythology. She was pioneering, visionary, and totally unique. Betty Friedan is often known as the housewife liberator. The problem with no name is how Betty Friedan, the journalist turned housewife, described the ailment that was bringing misery and despair to millions of women like her. In 1963, Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, and for many this marked the beginning of the women's liberation movement. Friedan diagnosed the discontent of women whose opportunities had been subsumed by the expectation of domestic lives. Women whose intellect and creativity lost out to society's demand that their chief purpose was as wife, mother, and homemaker. A woman's worth was locked in the four walls of the home, which became a prison, or as Friedan controversially suggested, a concentration camp. Friedan's book caused a huge stir at the time of publication. It released a genie that could never be put back in the bottle and was giving women the permission to ask for more than what society had previously allowed them. On the momentum of her book, Friedan went on to become a face of the second wave. She was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women and served as their first president from 1966 to 1970. She established the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws and helped create the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971, along with Gloria Steinem, a country-wise bipartisan grassroots membership organization in response to the fact that less than 1% of elected officials at the time were females. By the time of her death, The Feminine Mystique had sold 3 million copies. In time, however, revisionist theories began to grow around Friedan's writing. In 1984, Bell Hooks criticized Friedan, writing that she did not discuss who would be called in to take care of the children and maintain the home if more women like herself were freed from their house labor and given equal access with white men to the professions. She ignored the existence of all non-white women and poor white women. Whilst Hooks' criticism is legitimate and became a crucial refrain in the failings of the women's movement, it is unquestionable that Friedan articulated a feeling that unlocked an era-defining movement. The floodgates opened after Friedan committed women's problem with no name to paper and named it. Popularly known as the poet of the desperate housewives, Adrian Rich put the struggles of the second wave into verse. Rich articulated the misery of being a woman in a world dominated by men, stripped of ambition and trapped in domesticity. Her poetry reflected the situations of millions of American women who wanted more from life. In the title poem from Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, a collection of poetry published in 1963, she plunged deeply into the souls and psyches of many an American housewife. On her death, the New York Times wrote, she accomplished in verse what Betty Friedan did in prose, in describing the stifling minutiae that had defined women's lives for generations. Both argued persuasively that women's disenfranchisement at the hands of men must end. In 1976, she published the non-fiction book of Woman Born, a brutally honest examination of what it meant to be a mother, which British feminist Julie Bindel has called a classic feminist text. After a brief marriage resulting in 3 sons, Rich came out as a lesbian in 1977 with the poetry collection 21 Love Poems. In 1980, she published the essay Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, an exploration of both lesbians in society as well as lesbianism in relation to literary criticism. Rich explored other elements of marginalized society alongside gender and sexuality, such as her own Jewishness and the struggles of black women. When her poetry collection, named Diving into the Wreck, won the National Book Award in 1974 jointly with Allen Ginsberg, all women nominated had made a pact that they would claim the prize together in a show of solidarity. Rich took to the stage alongside Audrey Lord and Alice Walker and read out a statement they had prepared together. What was that statement they had prepared together? Here it is. We dedicate this occasion to the struggle for self-determination of all women of every color, identification, or derived class. The poet, the housewife, the lesbian, the mathematician, the mother, the dishwasher, the pregnant teenager, the teacher, the grandmother, the prostitute, the philosopher, the waitress, the women who will understand what we are doing here, and those who will not understand yet, the silent women whose voices have been denied us, the articulate women who have given us the strength to do our work. Rich's poetry is dazzling and innovative in its own right, but she made her poetry political and personal, and the stories she told were the stories of changing generation on the cusp of freedom. Gifted and brave, Rich wrote poetry that went beyond the arts, and it helped change the world for the better. Adrian Rich had famously said, "Your mind now, mouldering like wedding cake, heavy with useless experience, rich with suspicion, rumor, fantasy, crumbling to pieces under the knife edge of mere fact." These lines can be found from the poem Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law. Another pillar in the second wave feminism movement is Maria Rosa da Lacosta, a Marxist Italian. One of the key issues that came to shape the second wave was this debate around housework. Should women be paid for their labor in their own household? Many feminists thought they should, suggesting that their unpaid labor was yet another form of oppression under patriarchy. One of those feminists was the Italian-born Della Costa, Maria Rosa Della Costa. She had experience in the Italian workers' Marxist movement known as Operaismo, which came out of factory strikes in the north of the country. She was also a member of the Lotta Femminista, a small faction of the Italian feminist movement, also inspired by those same workerist communist ideas. After developing a political friendship with feminist Selma James, she organized a meeting in Padua in 1971 with James and others to share her ideas of a manifesto she drafted. Women should be paid for their labor in the home. A year later, she co-founded the internationalist feminist collective, which became the International Wages for Housework campaign. The group was a feminist expression of anti-capitalist aim to see women fairly remunerated and their labor no longer exploited. Together with James, she published The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community in 1972. By 1973, a chapter had launched in Brooklyn, New York, by Silvia Federici before spreading right across the states. 2 years later, Federici published Wages Against Housework, the book that came to symbolize the movement. Other faces of the movement erupted too: Black Women for Wages for Housework, Wages Due Lesbians, and Winvisible, that is, women with visible and invisible disabilities. Whilst Maria Rosa Dalla Costa's name might not be one of the most well-known of the second wave, she recognized a huge global inequality and began a very important conversation that was based on ideas of power, oppression, and women's roles in society. She took the ideas of Marx and applied them specifically to the lives of women, recasting what had been perceived as an inherently feminine responsibility as a political form of oppression and exploitation, and boldly demanded compensation. In doing so, she challenged the status quo and elevated the lives of women to a political endeavor worth fighting for. Now I shall talk about Jaya Desai, a brave voice for immigrant women. On a hot August day in 1976, Indian-born Jaya Desai walked out of the Grunwick film processing plant in Willesden, northwest London, and went on strike. What followed was 2 years of strikes with support from over 150 unions across the country. Cabinet ministers lent their support. The post office temporarily cut off the factory's mail, and one picket during 1977 drew a crowd of 20,000 people. Desai was a recent immigrant to London, having originally left India for Tanganyika with her husband, who was from the East African colony, now Tanzania and Zanzibar. She had always been politically engaged and outspoken, protesting for Indian independence as a schoolgirl. When she arrived in Britain and found herself underpaid and discriminated against, she was ready to speak out again. The conditions in Grunwick were oppressive, and the factory employed Asian immigrant women, assuming they could pay them less and work them harder. The women were forced to do overtime, had to ask for permission to use the toilet, were paid 70 pence per hour, which was below the average wage, and were routinely humiliated by the factory manager. When one of her colleagues was fired for working too slowly, and Desai was issued a formal warning for refusing to do overtime, she had had enough. She reportedly told her manager, "What you are running is not a factory, it is a zoo. In a zoo there are many types of animals. Some are monkeys who dance on your fingertips, others are lions who can bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager." After 23 months, the unions caved. The factory refused to reinstate sacked workers, and the strike to some had failed. But all was not lost. In a story that feels prescient to our time, an immigrant had challenged a discriminatory authority, and though her brave actions had for a moment led a movement with the support of tens of thousands of people, challenging the stereotype of submissive Asian women and challenging the idea that immigrant women could be treated as second-class citizens, Desai's bravery was an important moment in the working rights of immigrant women. Kate Millett was best known for her book, Sexual Politics. Sexual Politics was her dissertation at Columbia and turned the bestseller, and was published in 1970 and described by the New York Times that year as the Bible of women's liberation. On her death, Judith Shulevitz of the New York Review of Books wrote that despite being half forgotten, you can't deny that Millett made reading a life-changing, even world-changing act. So explosive was the book that Millett found herself on the cover of Time with a banner reading "The Politics of Sex." In the book, Millett focuses on male thinkers and writers including Freud, D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, and Norman Mailer, radically criticizing the literary canon for its depiction of women. She claimed that the use of sex in their work was degrading to women and supported a patriarchal system that infects culture, literature, and philosophy. Millett became a committee member for the National Organization of Women in 1966 before joining more radical groups such as the New York Radical Women. Millett continued to publish books on feminism throughout her life, covering issues of submission, torture, prostitution, and of her time spent in Tehran. She also wrote a book about her own bisexuality and her experiences suffering from mental health problems. She became involved in a radical feminist art group, exhibiting her own works across the United States in 2013. She was inducted to the Women's Hall of Fame. In just one book, Millett shook the foundations of the literary canon and was instrumental in the creation of a new wave of feminism. She saw how the portrayal of women played into the politics of power, and she called it out, awakening other women to what she had seen. Now let us talk about the scripter of the dialectic of sex named Shulamith Firestone. Shulamith Firestone is often known as the feminist's feminist. Kate Millett said of her, "I was taking on the obvious male chauvinists. Shuli was taking on the whole ball of wax. What she was doing was much more dangerous." Colette Price, an important part of the 1970s feminist New York scene, remarked, "To us she was the American Simone de Beauvoir. Even Simone de Beauvoir was impressed," telling Miss Magazine that Firestone had started something new. Shulamith Bath Shmuel Ben Afri Firestone, the family Americanized their name to Firestone when Shulamith was a child, was an art school student in Chicago when she started her first feminist group, but it was in 1967 when she moved to New York that Firestone began to mold radical feminism and push the women's movement in a daring, challenging direction. In The Dialectic of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution, her hugely influential book written in 1970, aged just 75, she said, feminists have to question not just all of Western culture, but the organization of culture itself, and further, even the organization of nature. Firestone, or the aptly named Firebrand or Fireball, adopted the theories of Marx, Engels, Freud, and Beauvoir into her own brand of radical feminist politics. She attacked the nuclear family for exploiting women's biological function as a means of oppression and envisioned a future where babies could be made in artificial wombs outside the body, preventing women from having to be pregnant at all. Pregnancy is barbaric, she wrote. Childbirth is like shitting a pumpkin. She called for wider access to contraception and abortion, as well as the elimination of not just male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. In 1967, she co-founded the New York Radical Women, the city's first women's liberation group. The group protested at the 1968 Miss America, where they threw fake eyelashes and pots and pans into a trash can of freedom and unfurled a large banner emblazoned with women's liberation. Firestone started the Red Stockings in 1969 and organized the nation's first abortion speak-out, for which she persuaded 12 women to talk publicly about their experience of abortion. One of those women was Gloria Steinem. Feminist activist and academic Anne Snitow said that Firestone was a flame, incandescent, but her radical spark disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Firestone became less active but continued to publish writings in the early 1970s before withdrawing from politics completely. Firestone's story has a tragic ending. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and dissociated herself from her parents. Her body was found in her flat a week after she had died. This isolation in her later life was believed to be a byproduct of her commitment to the women's movement, which itself had become internally fractured and externally ridiculed. Yet, Firestone herself knew the fight for equality wouldn't be an easy path. She wrote in The Dialectic of Sex, "Many women give up despair. If that's how deep it goes, they don't want to know. Others can continue strengthening and enlarging the movement. Their painful sensitivity to the female oppression existing for a purpose, eventually to eliminate it." That was Shulamith Firestone. Audrey Lord was a political black lesbian warrior wordsmith. She was a poet, a feminist, a lesbian, a warrior, a black mother, a teacher, and a librarian. Her many indefinites, that is the existence and the agonies and the ecstasy of them, was the subject of her poetry, essays, and speeches. For Audrey Lord, naming her multitudes was a form, political control, a rewriting of a narrative. As she once said, "If I didn't define myself, I would be crunched by other people's fantasies and eaten alive." Born to immigrant Caribbean parents in New York City in 1934, Audrey dropped the Y from her first name as a child and began writing poetry. As an adult, she became a librarian whilst continuing to write. She published her first collection of poetry, The First Cities, in 1968 and became poet in residence at the Tougaloo College, Mississippi. Audrey Lord took human experiences and turned them into political weaponry. Poetry was the expression of black womanhood. As she wrote in her essay, "Poetry is not luxury." The white fathers told us, "I think, therefore I am." The black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers, "I feel, therefore I can be free." Silence was Lord's greatest enemy. Silence allowed injustice, racism, and sexism. "We have to speak out," she urged. In one of her writings, she says, "What are the words you do yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day, in an attempt to make your own political until You will sicken and die of them, still in silence. Because I am here today, I am the face of one of your fears. Because I am woman, because I am black, because I am lesbian, because I am self, a black woman warrior poet, doing my work. Come to ask you, are you doing yours? Audrey Lord's writings for justice ring true today. She called for intersectionality and championed self-care long before it became an Instagram affirmation. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is a self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Her life was cut short. She died of cancer in 1992, but Lord's body of work is both timeless and prescient, offering generations a language of resistance. As she wrote, there are no new ideas. There are only new ways of making them felt. Reading Audrey Lord is like lightning in your veins, a new way of feeling.